And once we get them seated, you can start. Is that all right?
Yes.
Fabulous. That'd be great. I look forward. Oh, what a thrill. What a thrill.
Good. Good. Well, we have a nice turnout.
Yeah, right here. Okay.
David Pryor. Hi. I think we could definitely refer to this as the John Kenneth Galbraith Fan Club. We welcome you to the Institute of Politics, and my name is David Pryor. I'm the director of the Institute. I've had this great and high privilege for the last 2 years of being here with you, and I want you to know what an honor it has been for you to have allowed my wife, Barbara, and myself, and I think she's here. I hope she's not. She will be in one moment. How much we have appreciated you allowing us into your world here in this wonderful Harvard community. It's truly been a remarkable experience for us. First, let me announce that on Monday we will be having our final forum here. We invite all of you to come back. It will be the final one for this semester. We will have on this stage David Halberstam, who will be reviewing his new book entitled Firehouse. I think that you will find this book and David Halberstam both fascinating, and we urge you to come back. That'll be Monday at 6 o'clock right here in the Kennedy School of Government Forum. We will welcome all of you in your return. Tonight it is my very high privilege and very distinct honor to introduce truly a forum for the ages, a forum event with an American legend, a forum event with a true American icon. Born in neighboring Canada in 1908, and because he was born in Canada, that's the reason we probably never ran him for president. That is someone by the name of John Kenneth Galbraith, who has walked with kings and queens. He has become one of the most influential economists of the 20th century. He has authored over 41 books. He has served as a close advisor to President Roosevelt, Truman, Kennedy, Johnson, Carter, and Clinton, and he will be talking about some of these individuals during the course of this conversation with you this afternoon. But perhaps his greatest accomplishment has been his marriage to Kitty. And Kitty, we thank you for sharing once again Professor Galbraith. Thank you, Kitty. Thank you so much. To interview our special guest this afternoon is our friend and my neighbor at Quincy House, Professor Richard Parker. Richard is the author of the forthcoming book, John Kenneth Galbraith, the maker of American economics. Professor Galbraith, we want to thank you. We want to thank Professor Parker, both of you, for being here this afternoon, and especially Richard for all of the work and all of the help that you have been in helping to arrange for our very distinguished visitor to come to the Kennedy School of Government Forum this afternoon. Professor Richard Parker.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Pryor, for that very kind introduction. Here at Harvard, and especially here at the forum, I think it's safe to say that we're quite familiar with celebrity. Where I'm sitting here tonight have stood presidents and kings, movie stars and Nobel laureates, four-star generals and finance ministers. But with due respect to them all, let me say that we here are less familiar with fame. Celebrity in this age of infotainment and television touches many, but is so often a passing thing. Fame, however, touches a few, and unlike celebrity, endures. With me tonight is one of the nation's, if not the world's, most famous men, John Kenneth Galbraith. His fame, fortunately, makes my task easier, for it allows me to be brief. More than once, Professor Galbraith has said that for a competent Harvard professor, there should be no subject, however large, that it cannot be adequately presented in 50 minutes, the standard length of a Harvard classroom lecture. But Professor Galbraith himself is the living exception to that rule, because in 50 minutes I could barely begin to list his accomplishments. As Senator Pryor has noted, he's the author of nearly 4 books, to which I might add 4 books which have sold more than 10 million copies in 3 languages in more than 60 countries around the world. He has been not only the president of the American Economics Association, but also of the American Academy of Arts and Letters, a testimony to his range. He holds honorary degrees from more than 50 universities, including Harvard and Oxford. Curiously enough, not Yale, but we will not speak of that other place this evening. John F. Kennedy
mention Moscow.
And Moscow State University, I will also add, in lieu of Yale. Moreover, he's been honored by France with the Legion of Honor, by Canada with its highest civilian award, the Order of Canada, and by India with its highest civilian award. And I might mention here in the United States, he has been given the nation's highest civilian award, the Order of Freedom, not once, but twice, the only American ever to be so honored. During the Second World War, at the age of just 32, he became the nation's price czar, in charge of all civilian prices, and thereby the chief manager of America's wartime economy. At war's end, he became director of the Air Force's Strategic Bombing Survey. This is still the most powerful examination of strategic air power the country has ever produced. After the war, the State Department then put him in charge of planning the economic reconstruction of both Germany and Japan. Still in his 30s, he even found time to become for several years the senior editor of Fortune magazine, where he introduced America's most powerful business executives to the ideas of John Maynard Keynes, as well as his own. He was, for Adlai Stevenson in 1952 and 1956, a principal speechwriter and advisor. For President Kennedy, of course, he was ambassador to India and much more, personal confidant, sage advisor, the first among Kennedy's inner circle to see and warn against the folly that became Vietnam, not in 1963, not in 1962, but in 1961, 3 months after President Kennedy took office. For a time, he also served Lyndon Johnson, especially in the early days of planning the war on poverty. But as the war in Southeast Asia grew, Ken Galbraith took up the role of critic and dissenter, lending his voice to the campaigns to end the war and transform the Democratic Party, as well as the country. He recruited Eugene McCarthy to run for president in 1968, and it was at the center of the George McGovern campaign in 1972. But beginning in the 1970s, men like him found themselves increasingly isolated and in some cases rebuked. Richard Nixon and later Ronald Reagan and George Bush claimed that America was a conservative country, one, moreover, where the markets and private wealth had been unfairly fettered in their natural and rightful power and rank. Many fell in line with this new wisdom, but Ken Galbraith was not among them. Throughout the 1970s and 80s and 90s, as in the years before then, he continued to speak and write on behalf of a richer understanding of America and its place in the world, of our obligations to the poor, and of the necessity that democracies oppose entrenched privilege and power wherever they arose. In book after book, article after article, speech after speech, he argued not only for the widest and most generous understanding of democracy as inclusive and egalitarian, but the right and responsibility of democratic citizens to direct the economy for public ends. Moreover, he also did it always with the trademark Galbraithian wit. Thomas Carlyle, who once pronounced economics the dismal science, clearly never knew Ken Galbraith. For Galbraith, the challenge we as Americans still face is to rise farther than we have come to date, to be more than a nation of, as he once put it, the bland leading the bland. In this, economists need to point to more than optimal prices for things that help men and women see beyond the making and getting of everyday life. Or in his words, a man who reads Business Week is lost to fame. One who reads Proust is marked for greatness. This evening with Professor Galbraith, we're going to remember a few things from the past, but also talk of some things of the present and of the future. I have no doubt you are going to enjoy it. Professor Galbraith, I'm going to start by asking you to talk about 3 American presidents and their wives, men and women you've known personally, Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, John and Jacqueline Kennedy, and Lyndon and Lady Bird Johnson, and what they symbolized for you.
Well, I have to recover from my deep delight in that account of my history and tell you how much I enjoy being here, how much I appreciate the comments of the senator from Arkansas, which causes me to mention one of the great mysteries of American political life, which is why do all our really good politicians come from either Massachusetts or Arkansas? The other night, as some of you will remember, my mind went back to a hearing sometime in the 1940s or 1950s on the stock market. And Senator, I got the story wrong that night. While I was testifying, the stock market took a massive slump. And I didn't know it, but everybody else did. And Senator Fulbright, when it came time for questions, said, "Professor," I must say I was devoted to Fulbright. He was one of my closest friends. He said, "Professor, if the stock market falls out of bed today, we'll be blamed for it, won't we?" And I didn't know what was happening, and I said, if it should, Senator, that would be a short-run comment, but the historians will forgive you and us. And he said, "Could I remind you, Professor, that I am up for election this autumn and not those historians." My pleasure in the evening is modified, of course, by the extent that you will have to suffer, because like all people given to personal history, I enjoy hearing of my own from myself. Franklin D. Roosevelt and Eleanor Roosevelt have always been the largest figures, the largest political figures in my life and the life of my generation. I had 2 extended encounters with FDR, one just before World War II, when I was brought to the White House for a study of the relief programs, which I conducted for a couple of years. I was on leave partly from Harvard and later from Princeton. And it was a lovely experience, but I saw very little of FDR. Mostly I got encouragement. And one of the great moments of that time was something that brought a shrewd light on FDR. It was down at Warm Springs. He was downstairs there. Kitty and I have visited it since. And the question came up about the great relief programs, most of which involve some building. And should the emphasis be, as Harry Hopkins wanted, on the work that was provided, the people that needed those jobs? Should that be the basis of decision? Or should, as Harold Ickes wanted, and he had charge of the building that resulted, the Triborough Bridge or whatever it was, that was what historians would celebrate, people would celebrate, and that should be the test. When Harry Hopkins had finished, FDR said, "Harry, you're perfectly right." And in the afternoon, when Ickes came in and made his speech, FDR said, "Harold, you're perfectly right." And Eleanor, who had been listening to these hearings and taking it all in, when they had both gone, said, "Franklin, I just don't understand you. Harold comes in here and you tell him he's perfectly right. Harry comes in here and says something totally different, and you tell him he's perfectly right. I just don't understand you." And Roosevelt thought that over carefully and said, "Eleanor, you're perfectly right." The principal relationship I had with FDR was during the war years, when at a prematurely early age, I was put in charge of price control and put in charge of what was my own initiative, the General Maximum Price Regulation, which provided that you could lower a price but not increase it without government permission. And that lasted through the war. It worked. We have in World War II no memory of inflation, where in World War I prices doubled in the course of 2 years.
That's right.
And it gave me a very shrewd view, I thought at the time, of both the process of public administration and the people who were running the economy. I have to tell you a story about that, and then I will get back to Roosevelt. every afternoon we had a hearing in my rooms at the offices when somebody came in to get a higher price, was suffering. They were business executives. They wore nice blue coats and collars, nice blue coats and white collars, sat at a long table with my staff, and I would look down the table as they made their case. It was full employment, good, strong flows of orders, the best profits since before the Great Depression. And my staff would have their hands going like this on the table. And from now on, it is something you should remember, and you may on occasion have a lecture at Harvard where you will need it. That refers to the great period when there was a terrible shortage of food, a terrible drought in ant country, affecting an ant hill on the side of a great hill. And the queen ant mobilized the troops to go out and look for food. And presently, one day, a group of ants that she'd sent out, a detachment, came galloping back down the hill to where this ant colony was situated halfway down to say that a fine piece of food, horse manure, had just been discovered at the top of the hill. And she mobilized a force out to bring it back, and it was necessary to hold against it because the hill was steep and there was danger that it would go right down and be lost. So she got more and more of her troops to hold against it, and she went up and down with her antennae going like this, which in ant language means, "Stop that horse shit." And I would look down my table, and my very reputable staff would be going like this. And as I say, that is something which I give to you now for all future use, maybe even tonight. What question was I supposed to answer?
I think I know you well enough that a question to you is simply pointed in your direction and you will then take it where it will lead. Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, John and Jacqueline Kennedy, Lyndon and Lady Bird Johnson.
Oh, they're both Franklin Roosevelt, and in somewhat lesser measure, Eleanor, looked at the United States, looked at all the states as an extension of Hyde Park, for which they had the responsibilities of the family in charge, not as landlords, but the responsibility for everything on the estate. And this, in the case of FDR, was a human concern, how these people were surviving and suffering and what could be done. It wasn't an ideological reaction. Eleanor was more of a liberal, and this carried her into matters including race relations, voting power, and relief, into a deeper commitment than FDR. One consequence of which was that then, and again in the war years, when we had something about which we felt a very high level of urgency, we went to Eleanor rather than to FDR for two reasons. First, we had a more sympathetic audience, and second, we could get an appointment. And over her lifetime, she was one of my best loved friends. And there should be no doubt that in their humane commitment, at home and abroad, that the position of FDR was enormously strengthened by the association he had with Eleanor. Who else do I have to talk with?
The Kennedys.
Well, this was, for me, a very different situation. I lived, when I first came to Harvard, 1934, believe it or not, in Winthrop House, and two of our most distinguished residents were the two Kennedy brothers, Joe and the president-to-be. And through them, and through a long association I'd had with their father, not a long association, but a close one, I came to know them very well. And I came particularly to admire Joe Kennedy. One of the tragedies of American life was that one of the ablest undergraduates Harvard ever had was lost during World War II. It was from that background that life began with John F. Kennedy, who was intelligent, attractive, and not given to an excessive amount of work. He had that highly cultivated detachment from labor that marks, still to this day, a certain part of the undergraduate body. And from that came politics, from that came support, and I was identified to some extent with his campaigns for Congress, and very much with the presidential campaign. Very much. If there was a part of the country where there was no hope, or not much hope of election, but where they had to have somebody who was held to be close to Kennedy, I was sent. And I became, in that campaign, a real expert on the democratically hopeless parts of the country. But there was more. Because of Kennedy's father, there was a strong rift between the Roosevelts and the Kennedys. Mrs. Roosevelt did not come out for Kennedy when he announced that he was running for president. She was totally detached and even opposed. But she was at that time giving some lectures, television lectures at Brandeis, and I took on the job of persuading her that Kennedy was not Joe, and that he was someone she should support. And she finally said, this was the wonderful thing, that she would make the decision but she would like first to have him come on our television program. Wonderful. So I got in touch with him. He came up. It was New Year's Day. He went on the program, and it went beautifully. And there was a huge press conference afterward, and inevitably the first question was, Mrs. Roosevelt, does Senator Kennedy appearing here mean that you will be supporting him for the nomination? She said, it certainly does not. And that left the whole program behind and was the dominant news the next day. And that night, Kitty and I went over, as we often did on a Saturday night, to Lockover's, a famous restaurant in those days, for dinner with one or two others, including Professor Schlesinger. And as we sat down, Kennedy said, you know something, I always thought that it might happen that there would be somebody who's a college professor who would have some grace and ability on political matters. But can you prove it will never happen? Who else?
The Texan.
LBJ. He was, in some ways, the most misunderstood man we ever had in the White House. I had known him from his days in Congress and had been a consistent admirer and subject of amusement. He was a wonderful companion. And this was helped by the fact that we were exactly the same age, 3 months apart. And were naturally in Washington thrown together in the same age group and became close friends. And with the passage of time, I visited him down in Texas, went bird hunting with him one day. I didn't want to admit to him, as a Texas sportsman, that I'd never shot a gun. So I went in my Jeep, and he took his Jeep, and I pointed the gun up, closed my eyes, and fired it. The doves in Texas have never been so safe. And then came Vietnam. And this was something that covered up one of the ablest political leaders in our history, particularly in his relations with the Congress. It covered up his enormous commitment to the poor and the working community, from which he himself had in some measure graduated. And most important of all was Lyndon Johnson's commitment to civil equality and race relations. We have already to this day forgotten, that after Lyndon Johnson, one could go to the South without knowing that without expecting some sort of upset in a restaurant or in the back of the bus. This was his contribution, so far as anybody in politics could make a contribution. And as I say, that was plastered over by the Vietnam War. I have two recollections of that. One is the great riot at Chicago for Gene McCarthy. A riotous evening in the parks and a riotous evening in the convention. I was Gene's floor manager, and I have to tell you that that was an experience which I wouldn't recommend to anybody. To be a manager with no one taking your management is, well, as I say, I don't wish anyone to have the experience. But that was the night, I must say, of a personal note, that I knew the Vietnam War was coming to an end. Because we took turns going across Michigan Avenue from the hotel to a mass of people in the park who were demonstrating against the war. The great riots. And protecting the hotel, which was the headquarters of both of all the candidates, of both candidates, was a line of National Guardsmen, and standing shoulder to shoulder along the front. And I went through them my night, got up on a platform that had been rigged up, and made a report on what we were doing in organizing against the war. And also my plea that they stay away from violent action. Mayor Daley's police are always going to be better at that than you are. And it's just a matter of common sense to take a peaceful position. And then, immediately regretting I had said it, I said, I don't want you trying conclusions with these National Guardsmen who are standing here behind me. And then immediately I said, just keep in mind, they're draft dodgers just the same as you are. And immediately knew that I had said the wrong thing. And that was when I knew the war was coming to an end. That was my closing line. And as I finished, the sergeant who was in charge came up on the platform and said, "Sir, could I have a word with you?" And I knew that I was going to get it. He said, "I just want to shake your hand. That's the best thing that's been said about us all day." and that was my knowledge that the war was over. Sorry.
No, not at all. Your government service has always been in support of Democratic presidents, but you've also known some Republicans as well, too. Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan in particular. Would you mind giving us a few words on that?
Well, I didn't know Nixon personally. And a few years ago, I went down to give a lecture to the staff of the National Archives, and they dug up all the adverse papers that they could find on me, which is what they do for any speaker, and made the discovery that I had not known that Richard Nixon was on my staff at the Office of Price Administration and had written my letters. And he was on the facsimile papers that they gave me. I haven't anything much to add on Richard Nixon. He caused me the worst weekend I ever had. On a Saturday, we were up in Vermont. There was published the enemies list. And I was on it with 2 check marks. And everybody I knew called up and said, "How the hell did you get on that list and I didn't?" There was a mass of jealousy. Well, that's my view of Richard Nixon. Ronald Reagan, I never met him. Ronald Reagan and I did know each other. We were both founders of Americans for Democratic Action, ADA, a dominant liberal group of that time. And I knew him partly because he was one of the avenues of money that came to ADA from Hollywood, which we very much appreciated. Nothing smooths a relationship so much as a check. Then he went out on a lecture tour for General Electric for several months and began reading the material that was suggested to him for the audiences, and came to believe it, unfortunately. But it has to be said for Ronald Reagan, as it had to be said for his wife. They had one great virtue. They both enjoyed the job much more than they concerned themselves with the policy. And that was good. And now, in this day and age, I could be one of the very few people with some Democratic Party tradition who yearns for Ronald Reagan instead of our present situation.
You, for many years, have been among the most distinguished students of the British economist John Maynard Keynes, and yet in your works developed your own distinctive brand of thought that some have come to call the Galbraithian system. Would you care to describe for the audience what you think the elements, the most important elements of the Galbraithian system in economics are?
Well, I was greatly taken, as all my generation in the 30s, in the late 30s, by John Maynard Keynes. And went to Cambridge, England for a year to study under him. That was the year he had his first heart attack, and he never came to the university. There is no doubt about the importance of the vision he gave as to public policy, macroeconomic policy in those days. Here at Harvard, we had 2 classes of economists. Those who were still in the 19th century and very keen to get back to the 18th century. And those who were more modern and had the established Marshallian view of the economy, with great emphasis on the role of monopoly, corporate price fixing, Ed Chamberlain's monopolistic competition, which captured the largest part of the teaching and student position. And then there was a small minority who had gone on to a solid left position. That was and they held those of us who were more respectable and more cautious with a certain discomfort and even disdain. This was the mood of Harvard prior to Keynes, with, as I say, the greatest emphasis on impairment of the wage price and the price demand structure. The first book I ever wrote was on that. One of the most disastrous experiences of my life. It was called Modern Competition and Business Policy, and related the Depression to the fact that there were dominant influences holding up prices and limiting production, in contrast with agriculture, where the production is not controlled, where there's full employment and much lower prices. And in the spring of 1937, just as that book went to press, I read Keynes and changed my mind. But the book had gone to press, and it got very good reviews from all of the economists with whom I disagreed. The contribution of Keynes went far beyond economics, incidentally, but it was the first reputable view of macroeconomic policy imposed on the government, on the state, that you provided by the state through employment or through state-sponsored investment, the employment, the income, the purchasing power that did not come from the private sector. And that was a sweeping view, partly because of its extreme plausibility. And those of you who are here at Harvard should not be in any doubt. It was at Harvard that those ideas, through Harvard, that those ideas came to the United States. It was impossible after 1937 to avoid an evening seminar on Keynes. And they went through most of the daytime. And if there was nothing else that you could do, you could go to a meeting with Schumpeter to hear him denounce Keynes, which he did in a very eloquent way. And this was one of those rare times when every week some group came up from Washington, from the civil service, to discuss these matters. They came to Alvin Hansen's seminar. So that this was, in economics, a break point for a whole generation to which I belonged, moving from old-fashioned economics, including market structures, monopoly, and competition, to the notion of a public responsibility for maintaining the purchasing power that would keep businesses going, keep people out of work. It was a very interesting time.
You've had a few critics within the economics profession,
Pardon?
You have had one or two critics within the economics profession, certainly at the University of Chicago, the home of your good friend Milton Friedman. But there was also another University of Chicago economist, George Stigler, who, as I recall, on reviewing a book of yours, remarked that too many people were reading Professor Galbraith and not enough were reading Adam Smith. Do you happen to recall your reply to Professor Stigler?
I did. I said that I thought the point was well taken, but incomplete. That his great tragedy, his great sense was how few people were reading Stigler at all. But I have a good relationship always, an inner relationship with Milton Friedman, because he made me president of the American Economics Association. He was on the board when my name came up, and I had a majority, and he raised, or was near a majority, and Milton raised his objection that Galbraith was not the type of economist that should be head of a professional academic scientific group, and developed that point. And his closing comment was, let us keep in mind that Thorstein Veblen was never head of this organization. And that was so damaging, caused so much sense of guilt that I went through the next 5 minutes.
Professor Galbraith, in economics as well as in politics, you've long been associated with what some today refer to only as the L word, or when they refer to it at all, talk of it as a thing of the past. What does liberalism mean to you, and how relevant is it to us?
Oh, I would have no hesitation on that at all. I don't believe in categories. There are some matters where you want, many matters, where you want to exempt yourself from doctrine and apply your view in the particular case. Most of the results of that, I suppose, caused me to be called a liberal. But it is practical, or what one senses to be the practicable judgment for the well-being of people that should be the controlling doctrine. And that's what I try to have. So if somebody wants to call me a liberal, I'm prepared to accept it, like it, and ignore it.
You've been thinking quite a bit from our conversations earlier about Enron these days. Would you care to share your thoughts with us?
Put the question again, I didn't get it.
You and I have talked in recent weeks about your interest in the Enron matter. Would you care to share some thoughts?
Well, this is something that was in a sense predictable, even though it wasn't predicted. There is a tendency for the large corporation, which in most cases, one shouldn't doubt, has a very effective management. But there is a possibility of a step into error there, of which Enron was the magnificent example of a situation in which the operation of the controls within the corporation that are required simply get misplaced. For the most part, they do. But they don't get misplaced. For the most part, the corporation is an effective instrument for its own, for its purposes. That is why we no longer speak of capitalism. People who simply have money do not have the capacity or intelligence to run a modern corporation. The stockholders are paid a commonplace amount and instructed to register their position on matters which, when they register their position, make a proposal, are uniformly ignored. And but one shouldn't doubt that the corporation, as we have it, is something that works. We can worry about the extent to which it intrudes on public policy. We should all worry about the way in which what is still called the public sector has been taken over in the military area, the power of the defense industries. But it works. And what was your question?
What I think I'd like to do is actually invite some of our audience to join us for a couple of questions. Would you step forward to the microphone? We'll take just a few questions here. There's one over here, and I believe there are one and two up there as well.
I'll have you repeat them.
I shall. Do you want a drink of water? You want some water? Yes.
Professor Galbraith, my name is Niels Ehrman from the Kennedy School of Government.
Please speak slowly.
You touched upon your relation to Milton Friedman. And Paul Samuelson once said about Friedman that he has a lot of gifts and talents he is blessed with, but not the gift of the maybe. And I wanted to ask you if you could elaborate on your personal relationship and your view of Friedman as an economist a little bit more.
I didn't hear it.
Your views of Milton Friedman as an economist.
But what?
Your views of Milton Friedman as an economist.
My view of Milton? He is a very serious citizen, a very distinguished teacher, and the highest praise I can give it, he's civilized and comfortable and even at times appealing in spite of error.
I think that answers my question. Thank you.
Thank you. Up here, we have a question. Someone standing.
Arnold Simon, political economist visiting. There is one thing I would like to mention. In 1997, I did predict Enron with in the debate with Arthur Levitt and Congressman Markey to the T. Markey has audacity to use the terminology that I used then, but that's not my question. When I look at American management at the executive class of last 5 years, I'm astonished by similarity of character that reminds me Bolshevik nomenclatura. 90% of American executives think the same way as Bolsheviks. How can we get out of it?
Now, this is an interesting proposition for someone with a graduate degree from Moscow State University. Your questioner says that in his observation, the managers of the great American corporations think and behave like Soviet Bolshevik bureaucrats. Would you care to see whether there are examples to be, comparisons to be drawn out there?
Well, I think there's a point there that if you're running a large and complex organization, no matter where it is, there will be certain similarities. But you shouldn't allow ideology to intrude on that. It is one of the facts of organization, whether it's a Washington bureaucracy, a state government, or something in France or Moscow. So to draw conclusions from some similarities between organizations is something you shouldn't do.
Well, the key similarity is that they are both trying to steal as much as they can while it is going on.
Thank
and
you.
while they can.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Hi, Professor Galbraith, good English teacher. I'm a sophomore undergraduate. In the movie 13 Days, they talk about how India and I think China got into a conflict during the Cuban Missile Crisis. I was wondering if you could comment on any role that you had in, alleviating that conflict or conflicts in India in general when you were ambassador.
What the student is referring to, just so the audience understands, is that in October 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when America and the Soviet Union almost launched a nuclear war, what happened was that India and Red China also went to war. Professor Galbraith was the United States ambassador to India at the time and was given almost carte blanche by the United States government to aid and support the Indians in this matter. I think the student would like to have you comment a little bit about this experience.
Oh, this was a very intense time, and actually I had somewhat more authority than I knew I had at the time. That film that has recently been released has Kennedy dismissing the news of that war by saying, "Oh, Galbraith is handling that." I so regarded myself, but thought that I was, but didn't know that I had such agreement in Washington. The then Secretary of State, now alas gone, Dean Rusk, and I were not on the same wavelength. He was an old-fashioned Cold Warrior, and I was looking for a peaceful world, and that brought us into a difference of view on quite a few important matters. But that was a minor episode, which both in China and in India got out of proportion. The excitement in India was excessive, and my depth of my concern was excessive. And the reality came one morning, about 5 o'clock in the morning, when news came that the Chinese had offered a ceasefire. And I got out of bed, got the car, and went and saw Nehru to urge him to accept it. Because in the first place, the conflict was over some real estate you could only hope would belong to somebody else. and also, if I may say so, Indian emotion was getting out of hand. And I've had many pleasant encounters with Nehru, who was a really great figure of the century, but none that I appreciated so much as that, because I was exactly the person he wanted to see, so that among other things he could attribute the peace and the steps that were needed to peace to the United States. He didn't, but that was the possibility.
While we're on the subject of the State Department, you have offered a famous analogy to the subject of trying to communicate through the State Department. Do you recall that?
It's not the sort of thing that one centers on at a university, but perhaps I could make one exception. During my time in India, as at other times, I had a considerable direct communication with Kennedy and the White House. And this was very annoying to the State Department. And they sent a plea from Mr. Rusk to the White House asking that I be instructed to have all my communications come through the State Department. And I said, Kennedy, who on the whole, I think liked my letters and my telegrams, he wasn't certainly put off by them, wired me, sent a telegram asking what I thought of it. And I told Telegraph back that I didn't like it, that there was a particular problem. I put it in somewhat more rough language, that communicating through the State Department was like having sexual intercourse through the blanket.
Certainly not a routine topic for a university communicator.
One more question.
One more question, yes.
My name is Maria Cristina Caballero. I am a student here and a Mason Fellow at the Kennedy School. I wonder, how do you evaluate the results of the U.S. drug policy at the macroeconomic level? And what would be, from your point of view, the policy options?
Let me be sure I understand the question. The question is Professor Galbraith's views about U.S. drug policy
at the macroeconomic level.
At the macroeconomic level, and whether he would propose any alternatives.
What alternatives?
You're from Colombia, and of course.
I am from Colombia, yeah.
As to Colombia?
Well, U.S. drug policy.
I am not an expert on such matters.
My
I have the
on drug
strongest doubts about the present drug policy and the notion that it can be controlled by legal action. The same problem that was faced in my early youth with alcohol, and that we better revert to education and taxation.
Ladies and gentlemen, as I promised when we began this conversation, we were going to talk about some things past, but also some things of the present and of the future. I hope indeed that you have enjoyed this conversation with Professor Galbraith tonight, and I will repeat for you once again his advice. A man who reads Business Week is lost to fame. One who reads Proust is marked for greatness. To the name Proust, I would also add John Kenneth Galbraith. Thank you.
adoring fans here. Ladies and gentlemen, one announcement, if I may. Tonight, in behalf of the Institute of Politics, it is our tremendous, let me say, overwhelming pleasure to announce that in the beginning of the summer of 2003, there will be from here on a student internship, a summer internship, the John Kenneth Galbraith Summer Student Internship in this great man's honor for a summer. And finally, these events don't just happen. There's a tremendous amount of arranging for the forums and schedules and travel and hotels and planes and buses and cars and people and security. And this year, I think that we have had, Bill, if I'm not mistaken, where is Bill White? And where is Karen? And where is Scott? How many?
But I have one final word.
45 this semester. We've had 45 forums. And I can tell you they have gone off without a hitch. They have gone off beautifully. We have had heads of states. We have had former presidents. We have had former first ladies. We've had prime ministers. Just an amazing array of human beings have come here to share their wealth of information, their knowledge, and to impart that information and those life's experiences and to us. And I don't think we have ever had a better one than we have had this evening. But tonight, let me personally thank, after 2 years of working with, in my opinion, the best staff of people ever assembled, the staff of the Institute of Politics. And I would like, if we would, for all of those staff members to come right here and stand right here if you're here and take a bow. Come on, I know that you're out there. And Bill White especially. Bill White. We have a lot of... You won't believe at the Institute of Politics and the Kennedy School of Government that you have anyone who might work here who is shy, but we do. Come on, Karen, and I would like, if I could, come on, Julie. We have a large group. We have 14 people on our staff at the Institute, and they do so many great things, bringing us the forums, bringing us the new program we have on our book club, bringing to us our study groups and our fellows, the new members of Congress program, campaign decision makers, and all of the great programs that this staff brings to us. And especially the forum staff who works night and day, overtime and all the time, making these forums possible. We have Bill White and Karen Kane. Where is Scott? Scott Sebastian is somewhere. He's been around here all evening. I wish he would take a bow. He's a good-looking young guy. I don't know where he is. And he's single, too, I guess. But well, ladies and gentlemen, we want to thank you. And, oh, yes, Richard. Yes, sir.
Did you still want to? No. All right.
Yes. Do you want to say something?
Well, I was going to add two things. First, you shouldn't suppose for a moment that I haven't enjoyed this evening, and I speak on that for Catherine Galbraith as well, because usually when she disapproves of something, the frown reaches me very quickly, and she looked quite content. Yeah. The other thing is that much as I regret that our host tonight is going back to Arkansas, I must add to him the notion that he is taking with him a major gap in his accuracy, as evidenced in his speech tonight. He said that I had never been a candidate for the presidency. that is quite wrong. I was a candidate for the shortest time in the history of the United States. Catherine Galbraith and I were in San Francisco for a lecture in the 1980s.
60s.
What?
60s.
1960s. Sorry. And I got a notion that I had urgently to meet with a delegation of California Democrats who wanted to see me. It was the undissolved wing of California democracy, which can be farther from reality than any other political group in the world, but I still felt obliged to see them. And they had decided that they would put up my name at the convention a few weeks later as a candidate for president. And so they filed in, made that statement. It didn't take more than about 5 or 10 minutes. And the meeting was even over, immediately over, when I said that I was constitutionally barred because it requires that you be a citizen, born a citizen of the Republic, and I was not. And you have no idea how quickly a political meeting can come to an end. That was my run for president. And I contend, Senator, that it was distinguished by being the shortest in history.
That's a great story. Thank you. Thank you. Good night. Thank you all. Thank you.